What's going on, guys? My name is Wade with TechDaily, and in this video, we are checking out the new Samsung Galaxy S24 FE. This time around, the phone is bigger, it's got an all-new Exynos processor, it's chock full of everything AI, and it's still the phone Samsung is begging you to buy. But it doesn't seem like people are lining up for this year's FE once again. This initial poll from GSM Arena is pretty telling. So I'm curious to see if maybe this new FE can revive Samsung's beloved Fan Edition phone that previously was their most popular device, and I'm of course going to fill you in on everything else you need to know here. First things first, of course, let's just quickly unbox it so I can show you what comes inside the package if you do end up buying it. Peeling back those stickers and sliding off the lid, the first thing you get is the phone itself. I opted for the mint green color option, obviously, certainly the best color option. Setting that aside, you don't get anything else in the bottom half of the box, but hiding in the lid, there is a small packet of some stuff. No surprises here, really. You still get a SIM ejector tool, a USB-C cable for charging, a couple pamphlets of paperwork, and that's everything that's included with these smartphones nowadays. So with all that stuff out of the way, here is the new S24 FE. And as we peel off the last couple of stickers and power it on, you'll see during setup here all the Galaxy AI features that are included with this phone. And it's pretty much everything. Galaxy AI originally launched exclusively on the flagship S24s earlier this year, but we suspected Samsung would bring a lot of these AI features to their other cheaper devices, and some older ones too. And, well, that's exactly what happened. I know plenty of other Samsung devices also have Galaxy AI now via various One UI software updates that have hit over the summer, but Galaxy AI is a pretty heavily advertised feature on this FE in particular, so that's why I wanted to mention it. Now, as far as pricing and availability, this new S24 FE is going to be sold worldwide and will likely be pushed pretty heavily here in the US especially. If you aren't going to be buying a flagship S24, Samsung desperately wants you to buy this phone instead of, say, an A-series phone like the A35. The problem is that this new S24 FE isn't exactly cheap. The full retail price is about $650, and that's for 128 gigabytes of storage. For $710, you can double that to 256 gigabytes, and compared to the regular S24, you are potentially saving like 150 to 250 bucks depending on which option you choose. But the caveat there is that the flagship S24s have been out for like 8 months now, so they're heavily discounted on Amazon and from all the third-party retailers and carriers. Fortunately, you can also get a good deal on this new FE if you have something to trade in. The best option by far is trading in last year's S23 FE. If you have that, Samsung will give you $400 trade-in credit for it, which is honestly a lot. And their launch trade-in promotion actually has elevated offers for almost everything you can think of. So whatever old phone you have laying around should get you a few $100 off this new FE, which is definitely something you should take advantage of. So the first thing that's new with the S24 FE is actually its size. At 6.7 inches, this is not just noticeably bigger than last year's S23 FE, but it's now the exact same size as the flagship S24 Plus. Here's a quick size comparison. It's mostly taller, but also a little wider. And again, compared to the S24 Plus, it's practically the exact same size and dimensions all around. I don't necessarily think people will be cross-shopping this new FE with the S24 Plus. The Plus is just a lot more expensive, but it is interesting to see how big the FE is now. You still have slightly thicker black borders that frame the display all around, and a bottom chin that looks thicker to me, which is odd, but the screen-to-body ratio technically is better too by a little bit, mainly because of the overall increase in size. From the front, it looks pretty good, but I do think some people might still take issue with the bezels and the phone overall looking a little more budgety. As far as the build and materials, Samsung did go with Gorilla Glass Victus Plus for the front and the back, and the same aluminum frame as last year. Not only does the phone feel very premium, it once again looks exactly like Samsung's flagships. So you don't have to worry about someone thinking you have the cheap Samsung phone. Literally no one can tell this phone apart from the expensive ones. The color options this year, I gotta say, are a bit disappointing. There's this mint green along with a blue, and then graphite black, and bland gray. There seems to be a yellow option for maybe Europe or Asia, but just don't understand why we can't go back to the bright rainbow colors of the previous FEs. I feel like people would really like that. One other thing to note, the sides and frame of this phone are a heck of a lot flatter than last year's FE. The S23 FE had these rounded, curvy edges that made the phone feel bulbous and bubbly in my opinion, but this new FE is very flat all around. And it's also still IP68 water and dust resistant, so it should withstand an accidental drop in a sink or pool. Taking a look around at everything else, on the left side, nothing really besides a 5G antenna. On the right, your familiar volume and power buttons. Up at the top, a couple microphone holes alongside the SIM card tray. Now the US version of this phone supports one physical SIM and then multiple eSIMs. And this year's FE also does not support micro SD cards. Like I mentioned earlier, you can either get 128 or 256 gigabytes of storage, which isn't much when the phone ships with almost 11 gigabytes of pre-installed apps. You can certainly dump most of those, but I think Samsung also really wants you to utilize a cloud storage option with such little on-device space. On the bottom, there's a newly redesigned speaker grill next to the USB-C port and a giant blank spot where a headphone jack could totally still go. There's a secondary speaker above the selfie camera and around back, basically the same triple lens camera setup as last year. So in addition to the display being bigger, Samsung also boosted the brightness, which is always a welcome change, but that's really the only other thing that's new with the viewing experience on this phone. The big 6.7-inch screen is still the dynamic AMOLED 2X panel we had on last year's phone, and it's still not the exact same as the flagships, but pretty close. It's still the same 2340 by 1080 resolution, though with a lower PPI count of around 385 since the display is bigger in size. That resolution is totally fine, but one thing you do get in going with the S24 Plus, for example, is a quad HD screen. Again, totally different phones, but just something to keep in mind. And on top of that, it's also still an adaptive 120Hz refresh rate. The peak brightness jumps from 1450 nits to 1900 nits, still a ways away from the super bright 2600 nits of the flagship phones, but a nice bump up nonetheless that should absolutely help with outdoor viewing and cut down on some of that glare. The higher spec Gorilla Glass Victus Plus on the front should also help with that too. And overall, while the screen as a whole isn't drastically different than last year, I think it being bigger and brighter is something at least. I don't know that Samsung can make this display the same as the S24 or S24 Plus. I mean, they have to keep differentiating the flagships somehow, but I will say that for most people, looking at this screen and looking at a flagship S24 display, they won't see any difference. It's a great display overall, but I will just mention that it also isn't that much better than what's on this year's A35 and A55, which are much cheaper devices. So that's also something to maybe think about. You also might have noticed already that Samsung, for whatever reason, modified the speaker cutout at the bottom of this phone. And what's odd about that is that the physical design of the speaker grill shouldn't impact the sound quality at all. I'm sure it doesn't, but this new FE to me sounds worse than last year's S23 FE. I don't know why that is. I'm not aware of any actual changes to the speaker hardware, but yeah, just something I noticed. Now, the single biggest controversy with the new FE this year, I think, is what Samsung decided to do with the processor. Inside, this phone is now powered by Samsung's own Exynos 2400E chip, paired with 8 gigabytes of RAM. What does the E stand for? I have no idea, but this is a slightly less flagship chipset than the actual Exynos 2400, and not something hardcore Samsung and Android fans would have wanted at all. I think most spec-conscious people would have liked to have had a Snapdragon something or other powering this phone, even a 1-year-old Snapdragon chip potentially, and I feel like this choice might be the single biggest reason why some folks once again choose not to buy this phone this year. Here are the Geekbench scores for the 2400 FE chip. Like I said, it's a slightly lesser processor compared to the actual Exynos 2400, like 10% worse by comparison, but I know some people won't even touch this phone to begin with, regardless of the fact that it's new or flagship adjacent. The problem with Samsung's Exynos chips historically have been some combination of heat and optimization. The phones get hot very quickly, and they don't perform as smoothly as they might with a Qualcomm chip inside. Now, does everyone experience those performance blips? No, not necessarily, but heavy users and hardcore gamers have sworn off Exynos for like years now, literally, and it doesn't seem like that stigma is changing anytime soon. Should that be a reason to not choose this phone? I mean, for most average everyday people, probably not. You're still getting a nearly flagship phone for a few $100s less with all the Samsung and Galaxy AI features and the ecosystem experience you'd want. And in a similar way to how I described the display, if you gave this phone to someone who also had a Snapdragon powered device and told them to compare the two, I'm sure most people wouldn't notice at all. I've said this a few times now, but the folks who have sworn off Exynos, we're never going to buy this new FE anyway. And I don't think they'll be convinced, even if this is the best Exynos processor Samsung has ever launched. But for everyone else who just needs a decent or higher spec phone that doesn't cost $1,000, the Exynos chip isn't going to ruin the experience for you in using this phone, I don't think. Now, it should come as no surprise that this bigger phone can fit a bigger sized battery inside, so we get a slight bump up to 4,700 milliamp hours versus 4,500 milliamp hours last year. But that increase, I don't think, will really yield you much in day-to-day usage. Obviously, I'll put that to the test for my full review, but I think some of that power will just go towards the bigger sized screen. I'm more interested to see how the new Exynos processor fares, and as far as the rest of the charging and power features, well, they're all the same as last year. 25 watt wired, 15 watt wireless, and reverse wireless charging are all still there. Finally, when it comes to the camera setup, Samsung did sort of kind of change things up a little bit, but you have to look really closely to find that difference. On the surface, the main lens is still a 50 megapixel variety, just with a slightly different focal length. The 8 megapixel telephoto lens also seems to be the same, with the same 3x optical zoom and 30 times digital. But again, it went from a 76mm to a 75. The 12 megapixel ultra-wide appears to be the exact same as last year, and the selfie camera also changed just a tiny bit, but otherwise is the same 10 megapixel lens overall. Inside the camera app, Samsung really didn't add much to this FE. All of the core features and functions are the same, and anything that's new really just has to do with the AI add-ons like Portrait Studio and image editing. You can also create slow motion videos from any regular videos like we saw on the flagships. There's supposed to be better low light and nighttime pictures. They say the optical 3x zoom should be a little better too. But really, while the camera and photo features are usually like the number one thing Samsung and Apple and Google talk about, this FE doesn't feel like it's very camera focused by comparison. Instead, it seems like Galaxy AI is the bigger push this year, and the cameras are the same song and dance from last year. I think with a phone like this, software changes and AI add-ons have been and will continue to be the bigger changes versus outright hardware upgrades, but it's interesting to see a lack of anything major here that's new when that's usually the biggest selling point for the flagships. All in all, this new S24 FE continues to offer, let's say 85 or 90% of what you'd otherwise get on a flagship S24, but for a few $100s less. I like the fact that the phone is bigger. I think the Galaxy AI features will make this phone feel like a flagship too, but the Exynos processor isn't doing Samsung any favors, given its reputation, and most everything else with this phone, including its price, I think might not be as enticing to people who have been putting off upgrading over the last few years. But I could be wrong. What do you guys think of the new S24 FE? Is this the phone you've been waiting for? Let me know in the comments down below. I'd love to hear your thoughts, of course. Hopefully you guys did enjoy this video though. Be sure to follow TechDaily on Twitter and subscribe to the TechDaily YouTube channel if you haven't already, and I'll see you guys later.